we're going to start setting up the gameplay logic. Before we do that, we're going to make sure that the classes that we're going to use contain the correct variables that we're going to need during gameplay. Let's start with player underscore BP. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that class. And we're going to take a look at the variable section. Let's add a variable. We're going to call this variable which side. And it's going to be our which side enumeration that we've created. Because if we take a look in the content browser, we have an enumeration here called which side. So click on the variable to change its type. It's this little icon to the left. And we're going to do a search for which side. And it should show up. So click on that. And that is our which side variable. Our next variable is a float called nSpeeds. We have another one called ball hit. This one will be a boolean. We have another one called player ready, which is also a boolean. We have a variable called sides, which is a float. So just click on this little red icon here, change it to float, and right click on this little icon to change it to an array, because this is going to be an array. Our next variable will be called side index, and it's going to be an integer. So I'm going to right click on this to switch it back from being an array to a single variable, and it's going to be an integer. Our next variable will be called collision box sides, and this will be a float array. So change it to a float, and I'm going to right click on this to switch it to an array. If for some reason the right click doesn't work, just go over to the variable type, and there should be an icon to the right of it. You can switch it to whatever you want. An array should be there. Our next variable is called color index, and it's going to be a single integer. So I'm going to right click on this to switch it back to a single variable and change it to an integer. Our next variable is called player score, and it's going to be an integer. The variable after that is called CPU score, which is also going to be an integer. You have another variable called winbox sides, and this is going to be a vector array. So change it to a vector. I'm just going to right click on this to switch it to an array. We do have one more variable, but we can't access it yet. We have to create it first. I'll show you how to do that real soon. So what is this new variable that we want to add? Well, it's actually going to be a reference to our pause menu UI widget. We can't simply click the create new variable button and do a search for the variable type, because it won't show up in the list. Instead, we're going to right click, we're going to create a widget, we're going to do a search for pause menu, select that, drag off this pin, promote to variable, and we're going to call this pause menu. And as you can see, this variable has its correct variable type, which is pause menu, because it's a reference to that widget. You don't need this because we're not setting up logic right now. So simply delete that. Let's start creating default values for these variables. Which side will default to left side. nSpeeds will default to 1. Ball hit will default to false. player ready will default to false. Now for sides, we're going to create two array elements. The first one's going to be negative 187, and the second one will be positive 187. We have a side index, and that will default to 0. We have collision box sides, which will add two elements to. So add two elements. The first one will be 98. The second one will be minus 72. Okay. Puller index defaults at 0. Player score defaults at 0. CPU score defaults at 0. Then we have win box sides. We're going to add two array elements to that array. So add two elements. The first one will be 0. And then minus 507. And the second one's going to be the same, but it's going to, instead of being minus 507, it will be positive 507. And pause game menu, or pause menu, will just be whatever it is. We're now done setting up the variables for the player. So now we're going to go ahead and do the same for the CPU player. So open up the CPU player, and we're going to start setting up the variables for this class. Okay, so the first variable we're going to make is ball. So on the variables, hit the create new variable button, and we're going to call this ball. It's going to be a reference to the ball. So do a search for ball, BP. Our next variable will be called end speeds, and this will be a float. Our next variable will be called ball hit, and this will be a boolean. Our next variable will be called sides, and this will be a vector array. Our next variable will be collision box sides, and this will also be a vector array. Our next variable will be win box sides, and this is also a vector array. And lastly, we have a variable called CPU speed, and this will be a float, but not a float array. It will just be a single variable, float. Let's set the default values for these variables here. So ball is okay how it is. End speeds, we're going to set that to 1. Ball hit, it defaults to false, so that's fine how it is. Now sides, we're going to set the values for sides. We're going to add two elements, and the y for element 0 for the first element is going to be 187, and the z is going to be 10. Now for the second element in the array, the y is going to be negative 187, and the z is going to be 10. Now for collision box sides, we're going to add 2 array elements to this. This is going to be -46. So -46. And for the second one, it's going to, the y is going to be 78. For win box sides, we're going to add 2 array elements. For the first one, y is going to be 602, so 602, so 602. And for the second one, it's going to be -602. Okay. And lastly, CPU speed is going to be default value of 1. So I believe we're done setting the variables and the defaults for the CPU player. So I think we're about done with setting up the variables and their default settings. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to start setting up the logic for gameplay.